Greetings, colleagues. I'd like to present my research findings on Venezuela, particularly what is going on with the ongoing crisis, how the country is near total collapse, and what this means for U.S. national security and what the appropriate responses are. A large portion of this will look at the policies of Hugo Chavez and his predecessor Maduro, where they were swept into office electorally with high hopes from the Venezuelan people, but since their policies have fully taken hold, you've seen utter collapse and corruption and tyranny occur that they so adamantly campaigned against back in 1998. Looking first at the overview of what I'm going to look at, we're just going to quickly look at the overview of the crisis currently in Venezuela, the roots of the crisis, kind of the historical causes of it, the rise of Chavez, and then take a look at the rule of Chavez, his first years in office, but also kind of, he was, in a sense, there was misdirection to what he did. While on the one hand, he sought to do good through the people through socialist policies, he really set out from day one trying to consolidate power and prevent anybody from challenging his rule, and he used it through the democratic process, whereas his predecessor or successor Maduro has not been able to do so. We'll look at Maduro's struggle to maintain power. Things have really deteriorated and begin to accelerate towards collapse under his rule, and any threat that he sees to his power, he continues to tighten the reins over controlling the government. We'll take a look at Venezuela and U.S. national security. I mean, why does Venezuela matter from a military perspective? Venezuela does not pose really a threat to the United States, but should Venezuela collapse, it has a number of regional security challenges to Latin America and South America, as well as hemispherical security challenges when we look at the involvement of Russia and China now in the region, as well as Cuba, and also the effects it could have on the global the global oil market. We'll look at responses to the Venezuelan crisis, what is ongoing through the Trump administration, and what are some possible avenues for ending the crisis, and then take a look at a Christian perspective on the Venezuelan crisis, appropriate approaches, and then hopefully be able to tie in a reasonable conclusion to this. Now, looking at the crisis in Venezuela, the story of Venezuela is kind of tragic when you really look at it. In a period of 4 decades, it has gone from being one of the most abundant countries in South America to being one of the most destitute. So really right now it's on the verge of collapse. In 2016, the economy contracted 18.6%. Each subsequent year has been projected to contract at least 6 to 8%. You have a great period of hyperinflation going on right now. Estimates have it as anywhere as low as 290% to as high as 800%. As you see on the news broadcasts, there are scarce resources. People can't buy basic needs such as food or toiletries, things like that. The government is also on the verge of financial default. The government is highly dependent on revenues from oil, and as oil markets have kind of plummeted, comparatively speaking, to where they were in the early 2000s, the Venezuelan government has certainly felt the pull from that as they've tried to continue to increase social welfare spending, but they no longer have the tax-based revenue to continue the same level of spending. The murder rate in the capital city of Caracas is the highest in the world currently, with lots of rioting and looting going on and suppression of protests. Many people are dying. And you look at basic needs such as food, water, and medical care. One statistic or one scenario I find interesting: 40 years ago, Venezuela was one of the only countries in South America to essentially successfully suppress malaria. But now, because of a lack of appropriate medical care and a lack of medical supplies, there is a resurgence of malaria in the country. You have rolling blackouts occurring throughout the country where people are literally dying in hospitals because the equipment won't run because the government can't afford to keep the lights on. The quote I hear is from Alberto Ramos. He's the chief Latin American economist for Goldman Sachs, and recently he was interviewed about the situation in the economy, and he said the economy is really chaotic. It's totally collapsed. and it's at the point of no return, which is a very scary scenario. Normally you can find some ways to salvage the economy. It's almost at the point where it's just going to completely unravel, and you're going to have a failed state in Venezuela. So the roots of the crisis, looking at pre-Chavez Venezuela. Venezuela was, again, one of the only 3 democracies in Latin America. The 1970s really marked a high period for them. Between 1974 and 1979, the OPEC oil crisis had caused a rise in global oil markets, and that created a windfall profit for the country. The government could spend money more liberally on programs they wanted. They had a large middle class spurred on by economic growth rates that were at an all-time high. Unemployment and economic inequality were all-time lows for the country. It would not be uncommon to drive into Caracas and see everyday middle-class Venezuelans sitting around a new Cadillac or a new Buick they'd purchased. Their upper class frequently took trips around the world, going to places like Miami and Rio de Janeiro and spending exorbitant amount of monies. They called them, they would buy 2 of everything when they traveled. It was really one of the 3 stable democracies at the time. And part of that dealt with the Punto Fijo 2-party system that brought political stability to the country after the Jimenez dictatorship was overthrown in 1958. We'll get back to the Punto Fijo system in a second and how that kind of contributed to the crisis, but it brought relative political and economic stability to the country. However, the 1980s and 1990s, Venezuelan prosperity begins to slowly end. You have lower global oil prices, which results in a decreased amount of revenues to the government and reduced economic growth. As a result of the reduced spending, really the only players in the game were those that were associated with the 2 major parties. So the Punto Fijo system is increasingly seen as exclusive and corrupt. If a person didn't identify with one of the 2 ruling parties, they weren't privileged to any of the largesse of government spending and economic growth. You had a large movement of rural Venezuelans to urban areas that were not able to find aid or work, and you had a large rise of barrios around the cities in Venezuela and a growing impoverished class within Venezuela. It comes to a head in 1989 with the Caracazo riots. It really just demonstrated how social tensions were growing to a boiling point in the country. Now, kind of stepping back a little bit, we'll look at Chavez. His upbringing socioeconomically and his military career kind of influenced who he was, his influence, his political ideology, and his worldview. He was from the lower middle class. Well, why does that matter? Is Venezuelan army officers were typically recruited from the lower middle class. There was kind of this separation between the lower middle class and the upper classes in Venezuela. Prior to him joining in 1971, the army had just put down a leftist anti-government guerrilla uprising. However, they didn't completely put it down in the sense of they didn't eliminate all the members. The surviving guerrillas retooled and said, hey, we're going to infiltrate the Venezuelan army and try to bring about a military coup through an alliance of the military and civilians that are sympathetic to our cause. Well, having so many lower middle class members within the Venezuelan Army Officer Corps, they could find some sympathy among this group, Chavez being one of them. Chavez himself idealized Simon Bolivar, who was seen as the great liberator of Venezuela, who fought against the colonialist Spaniards, and he really seeks to model himself as a modern-day liberator of Venezuela. He's going to rise up and challenge the aristocracy in Venezuela, the Punto Fijo system in Venezuela, in much the same way that Bolivar challenged the Spaniards and the royalist aristocracy back during the 1700s and 1800s. In fact, he gives his revolution the moniker of the Bolivarian Revolution. Now, the rise of Chavez, or what I call the Ahora. The Cuban Revolution really influences Chavez and many members in his group and many of the members of the Venezuelan military. They believe a military coup would be the best way to overthrow the government in Caracas. And as global oil prices continue to drop, the civil unrest grows. The Caracazo riots inspire Chavez and his followers to attempt a coup. 3 years later, in February 1992, he leads a military coup and fails. However, as he's arrested, he gives a speech to his followers known as Por Ahora, in where he says essentially the revolution is dead for now, but that they will rise again. And it struck a chord not only with followers, but those that were disaffected within disillusioned within Venezuelan society, and it helps bring his popularity through the growing dissatisfaction with the Caracas government in the 1990s. Now, as Chavez returns, he's imprisoned, but he uses the time to re-examine and reorient his revolution, his strategy. He's influenced by others that his revolution should not be achieved through force, but electorally. So he focuses on ways of generating support among the public so he can win as the ballot box. His Por Ahora speech, again, it helps the disaffected Venezuelans to find inspiration. They begin to support his revolution. Groups that are outside the two parties that were marginalized begin to coalesce around Chavez's anti-government message. They see him as the answer to the corruption in Caracas, and in 1998, he wins the presidential election. Now, onto the rule of Chavez. He calls himself a warrior for Venezuela, a warrior for true democracy. Ironically, the day before he's elected, he gives a speech and he criticizes the government that had been in place, and he says a country in which corruption is rooted in the political leadership is a dictatorship. It is ironic because almost 20 years after his ascension to office, that is precisely what the country is in. It is corrupt, it is tyrannical, it is a dictatorship. He takes office saying he's going to be a warrior for the people. So one thing that helped him in the very beginning was global oil prices. They begin to surge in the early 2000s. So this makes his social welfare spending a cornerstone of his policy agenda. Things he focuses on is increased education spending on adult literacy, increased spending on food programs for the poor and impoverished, creation of community councils to give local communities a say in national politics, and many other ways of supporting, providing employment, providing aid and assistance to the downtrodden and oppressed in Venezuela. He really says he's not a capitalist, he's not a socialist either, that he's practicing a gentler kind of capitalism. Many people label his regime socialist, and in fact, when you look at many of the things he actually does once in office, it would align more closely with the socialist ideology, and certainly how he makes bedfellows with global leaders such as Castro and China and certainly Russia begs the question that was he truly just a gentler capitalist? When you look at Maduro's first years in office, many citizens are kind of distracted by the gains he's making with his social policies. There's this new prosperity brought about through increased employment, increased social welfare spending and aid. People are seeing an increase in standards of living, better access to food, better access to medical care. But at the same time, he uses this concept of being a champion of the people, exercising the people's power to ultimately consolidate his own power and concentrate power in the presidency. Early on, he wins a referendum to rewrite the Venezuelan constitution to favor executive power. He begins to place his military allies in positions of power within his cabinet and also within civilian positions and over state-run agencies. He begins to expand the Supreme Court of Venezuela to kind of pack the court and place judges that are friendly to his policies, also that they could strike down any legislative acts by the opposition. He begins to pack the National Electoral Council to create voting laws that are favorable to his election. Chavez is very much focused on the legitimacy of elections in a sense. He wants to appear democratic. He wants to appear as elected by the people, but he's not going to chance losing elections, so he needs to rig the rules in his favor. He also takes control of the state-controlled energy sector, which I'll get to in a second, how that ultimately failed. And then he begins to seize non-governmental institutions, labor groups, businesses, private land, universities, and you begin to see a mass exodus of the educated class leaving Venezuela, and that's going to come into a problem. When it comes time to salvage the economy, they've kind of lost the brain trust to go about and fix these things. Now, looking at the coup of 2002, this is very important. not everybody agreed with his policies. Again, the coalition he built to take power in 1998 was really just centered on these populist themes of anti-government, anti-corruption, anti-establishment. But they didn't necessarily all buy into the policies of Chavez. So as they become aware of what he really stands for, they attempt a coup. This coup fails. It's odd. It lasts for 2 days. Chavez is asked to step down from power. Then he's reinstalled in power. But he takes two primary lessons for this. First, he begins to see that his power is not safe. So he's going to find ways to crack down on political opposition and to secure his power. And second, you see a ramping up in his foreign policy of anti-Americanism. He blames the United States, despite U.S. denials of intervening in the military coup. He blames them for trying to take him out. And this kind of builds on his myth as this new Simón Bolívar. Now, corruption, mismanagement, the failure of the Venezuelan oil market. This is a very important thing to understand. We can look at the social and economic policies of Chavez, but really it kind of comes down to oil. Venezuela is very, very dependent on oil. They have to import a lot of their things, but oil is their main export. They're the second largest supplier of oil, I believe, outside of Saudi Arabia. There's a strike in 2002 to 2003. And Chavez then goes and fires 19,000 employees in the oil industry. And many of these fired workers had worked in the industry for many years. They were very knowledgeable. They were very experienced. Well, Chavez doesn't replace them with experienced workers. He pays off people that are loyal to him, military leaders that are loyal to him, regardless of experience. Well, they have no idea how to run the oil industry. What's kind of keeping them afloat at this point is high energy prices, but they begin to not be able to export oil and be able to extract oil at the same level they did before. So they open up international oil companies to help extract and export their crude. Chavez begins to increase his social welfare spending, and he's demanding larger and larger royalties from these oil companies who begin to say, no, we are not going to do this, we're pulling out. His loyalists that he's put into place now don't have the knowledge to run the oil industry, and essentially they have no way to extract and produce and export oil at the same levels as before. Another important point is Venezuelan oil extraction is a very cost inhibitive enterprise. It takes a lot of money to produce their oil. So that's why they need oil prices to be high to justify getting it out of the ground. Well, part of that is they need to continually reinvest in their infrastructure and technology for extracting oil. Chavez isn't doing this. He's using all the extra money to spend on his social welfare program. So essentially, their technology is not up to par when it comes to exporting oil. Really, when you look at the legacy of Chavez, and I know I've kind of glossed over 5 or 7 years here towards the end of his presidency. Certainly he was ill towards the end and didn't play as large of a role, but you're really noticing that Caracas is becoming highly militaristic in its government. He's appointing loyal military officers to his cabinet, to state-run enterprises, and corruption, bribery, and power consolidation of the executive become commonplace. People can't business license, can't get food, can't get what they need without some sort of bribe given to state officials. The economic policies under Chavez are very statist. Private investment, foreign direct investment, industry growth were very minimal during this time. Business is also severely regulated. And then key industries such as water, electricity, and telecommunications are becoming nationalized. Chavez begins to even reach into mundane industries from hotels to cement production to construction, and tries to make those as part of the state apparatus. His foreign policy is really marked by anti-Americanism. He sought to spread that throughout the region to create kind of a sphere of influence over South America and Latin America as the anti-American leader. He also wants to strengthen relations with U.S. enemies, bringing in China, Russia, and Cuba to counter American influence in the region. Now, Maduro, President Nicolas Maduro, follows him to power after Chavez dies. And Maduro really struggles to maintain power. And this is really where you see kind of the unraveling and the move towards autocratic rule. His real shortcomings, he's not nearly as charismatic as Chavez. He certainly has the socialist bona fides to be socialist Bolivarian leader. He's a former bus driver. He's described as a hardline Marxist operative. But essentially, people are growing tired in 2013, 2014 of the regime in Caracas. His election in 2014 is much closer, and he really has difficulties continuing Chavez's legacy. So you begin to see him try to consolidate and tighten his grip on power. He really becomes the new dictator as his opposition increase and lower global oil prices occur, sinking the Venezuelan economy. His hold on power is weakened, so he tries to find ways to strengthen that and become more autocratic. He starts first by attempting to dissolve the legislative body, the National Assembly, when the Democratic Unity Roundtable, the opposition party, takes control. He also uses the Electoral Commission to deny opposition attempts to have a recall election of Maduro in 2016. He uses the Supreme Court, which is loyal to him, to revoke the National Assembly's power over the economy and to also prevent them from releasing opposition political prisoners. He attempts to eventually dissolve the National Assembly and replace it with a supranational assembly known as the Constituent Assembly to rewrite the Constitution and the nation's laws. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, all 545 seats of this assembly go to Maduro's supporters, and mainly because the opposition just stays home. They view it as illegitimate. Now, looking at Venezuela and U.S. national security, it poses a number of regional and hemispherical security challenges for the United States. Direct threats to the U.S. national security. When we look at the Venezuelan military, it's going to pose no threat. We have no concern about Maduro taking up arms against the United States. However, what we're starting to see is a massive refugee crisis as Venezuelans flee the United States. In 2016, over 160% increase in Venezuelan political refugees were coming to the United States. There's also some concerns regarding the war on terror. Top Venezuelan officials have been known to talk with Iran and Hezbollah in giving them false passports, false Venezuelan passports. The problem with that is Venezuelans are allowed free access to many countries in the region, over 130 countries around the world. And this mass influx of refugees will affect not only neighboring countries, but European allies as well, as refugees can head to those countries, but also terrorists can gain these false passports and gain access to those other countries. There's also the instability spillover effects. Venezuela, as the refugee crisis expands, it's spilling over to surrounding countries, undermining the process of democratization, commerce, and stability. As countries are trying to seal off the border, you're seeing less cooperation within the South America, North America hemisphere. Now, threats to the Monroe Doctrine. As the Venezuelan economy collapsed and it ramped up its anti-American rhetoric, it really began to struggle to export its oil. Antagonistic, revisionist states such as Russia and China have come to the aid of the Maduro regime. China in particular has been one of its largest financiers, lending over $60 billion since 2001. Russia in particular has been their largest supplier of military equipment, and they've developed contacts within the Venezuelan military. Russia is also providing an export market for Venezuelan crude. And then Moscow's also agreed to help Venezuela restructure some of its debts. And one of the problems to look at too is if you have a regime in Caracas that's friendly to Moscow and Beijing, it could give these countries a foothold in the Western Hemisphere to challenge American hegemony on this side of the globe. Now, as far as global oil markets, the political and economic crisis in Venezuela have reduced their oil production by 2.2 million barrels a day. So they're roughly producing half of their capacity each day. This reduction is causing global oil prices to surge up, is one reason we're seeing higher prices at the pump. Now, the U.S. has been able to survive some of these shocks due to its shale oil production, but there will be eventual spillover effects. As global oil markets are stressed, it will eventually take its toll on domestic energy prices in the United States. Now, looking at U.S. responses to Venezuela. To date, really, Trump and Obama have held kind of the same response. It's mainly executive order, mainly agreeing that Venezuela is a problem. There's no kind of clear solution or consensus on what to do in the region. Obama issued an executive order in 2015 authorizing the Treasury Department to use targeted sanctions against people in Venezuela that were responsible for human rights violations, persecution of political opponents, dismantling of civil rights and liberties of the people of Venezuela, Venezuelan political officials engaged in government corruption, attempts to stifle the free press, in assembly and protests in Venezuela. Those would all fall under that executive order. Trump followed with his own executive order in 2018, and the main thrust of that executive order dealt with a prohibition on any purchase of debt owned by the government of Venezuela. Now, looking at potential policy options in Venezuela, there are three main ones: a military coup, an oil embargo, or some sort of negotiated settlement. Now, with a military coup, the reason to go that route is dialogue and diplomacy generally have failed. Maduro doesn't maintain many contacts with those with the United States, and he really doesn't seem to want the crisis to come to an end. Also, the Venezuelan military represents the greatest tool that could go about ending the crisis. They could forcefully remove Maduro from power. The problem is the U.S. doesn't know what outcome of a military coup and a new administration would look like. As I mentioned earlier, China and Russia have built up contacts within the Venezuelan military, so you could potentially have a coup to remove Maduro, but the new regime, a new military regime, would be more friendly to Moscow and Beijing and not friendly to the United States. Looking at an oil embargo, there have been discussions of a total embargo on Venezuelan oil exports. This could be considered kind of the death knell to the Maduro regime. It would totally collapse the economy, get the people to turn on Maduro finally. Unfortunately, the difficulty in that is many Latin American and Caribbean countries do depend on Venezuelan exports, and it would complicate their economies and strain relations with the United States. The third option is a negotiated settlement, where the U.S. would agree to provide humanitarian assistance and aid in the form of food, clothing, vital supplies, medicine, medical care, in exchange for the needed economic and political reforms to turn Venezuela around. The difficulty in this approach, again, it deals with the fact that Maduro might not want to come to the table. He's unlikely to come to the table if he feels like he's going to be held responsible for his crimes and human rights violations. Briefly looking at a Christian perspective and understanding this troubling situation and looking at it through a Christian worldview, I'm going to take a look at the idea of humanitarian intervention and just war theory. So really some ideas that a Christian must consider when looking at Venezuela are, first, the idea of intervention, especially humanitarian intervention, typically involves some use of coercive force. Now, when looking at justifications and legitimate objectives, justifications include mass starvations, human rights abuses, refugee crisis of undemocratic regimes and failed states. Certainly looking at Venezuela, all of those fit the criteria for justifications for interventions. And then considering the objectives of intervention, replacing the offending regime, providing aid, restoring justice in the economic and political order. Certainly those are just goals when considering an intervention into Venezuela. But ultimately, what complicates all of this, and Charles and Demi point this out in their book, War, Peace, and Christianity, is ultimately military intervention and coercive measures more often than not appear the only plausible way of preventing or retarding gross humanitarian suffering and oppression. At some point, it would require the United States military to step in and forcibly remove Maduro and his regime in order to bring an end to the crisis. And from a budgetary aspect, the United States is already dealing with a number of issues across the globe. Do we have the necessary resources to deal with that? Now, certainly one could make the argument it's in our backyard. We should be worried about that first, and certainly it would be justified to use that. But the American public, certainly after Iraq and Afghanistan, are reluctant to put U.S. soldiers in harm's way for these humanitarian interventions and state and nation building. Now, conclusion. When you look at the Venezuelan crisis, it's going to be one of the biggest crises in the national security future for the United States. Some people argue that it will eventually be bigger than North Korea, and certainly Venezuela's proximity to the United States lends credence to that idea. Also, the stability of South America and the Western Hemisphere are vital to the security and economic security of the United States. We want democratic regimes in place in this part of the globe. We want to have free trade and friendly relations with the nations of the Western Hemisphere, and to have antagonistic and failed states within our area poses significant concerns. One thing overall is to consider, though, is the Maduro regime seems only focused on maintaining power. Diplomacy and dialogue don't seem to work. He's clearly embedded in power. He's clearly ignoring calls to restore democratic processes to Venezuela. So he seems hell-bent on holding on to power. And really, that leaves two main options on the table. And really, when I look at it, oil sanctions seem to be the quickest way to bring an end to his hold on power and should be used first. And then military coup and U.S. military intervention should really become a resort of last option. Really, from the two concerns I mentioned earlier, from a military coup perspective, we don't necessarily hold the same relations with the Venezuelan army. You might have interference by Russia and China to create a new government that is more favorable to them and less favorable to us. And the cost expenditure of deploying U.S. troops to Venezuela to engage in a regime overthrow and a nation building exercise would certainly stress our budgets. And these are the sources if you'd like to take a look at those.